Chapter 31, Section 1 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part II. The Student's Roman Empire, Part II, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 31. Roman Life and Manners. Section 1. Life at Rome. Under the Empire, Rome wore a very different appearance from that which she had presented in the days of the Republic. We have already seen that the Principate of Augustus inaugurated a new era in the history of her architecture. Numerous splendid buildings are a feature of Rome in the imperial age. Ovid and Martial call her Golden Rome. But she has taken upon herself more decidedly, not only in external dignity, but also in the constitution of her inhabitants, the character of a capital of the world. Hundreds of races met within her gates. Many languages were spoken in her streets. Eastern princes and tattooed Britons, rough Dacians and grim Sugambrians, Arabians and Ethiopians, Thracians and Sarmatians, were to be encountered in the Forum. Hadrian's friend, the sophist Polemon, called the city a compendium of the world. The chief portion of the foreign population were Greeks. "I cannot bear this Greek city," says a speaker in the satire of Juvenal, but he goes on to confess that the Greeks are perhaps not the worst feature. There was also a large multitude of Syrians. The Syrian Orontes has long since emptied itself into the Tiber. Most of these strangers were adventurers who lived by their wits. The versatility of the Greeks was proverbial, and the men who flocked to Rome from Achaia and Macedonia, from Asia Minor and the islands, were ready to undertake any employment that was required, and make themselves useful in the houses of the wealthy people who lived in the Esquiline, the west end of Rome. The starveling Greek knows everything. He is a grammarian, a rhetorician or engineer, a painter or a trainer, an augur or a rope dancer, a physician or a magician, anything you please. He will go to heaven if you bid him. These Greek adventurers were adepts at ingratiating themselves by flattery, and outran the needy Roman competitors in the race for the favor of the great. Rome was the great hunting field for adventurers and knights of fortune. A large portion of this foreign population were slaves, a class which formed more than half the total population of Rome. The number of slaves in all the large towns of the empire was enormous. The price was cheap. A young male slave of good character could be bought for 20 pounds, a girl of 6 years old for about 8 pounds. Notwithstanding the feelings of humanity which began to pervade society in the 2nd century, owing partly to the spread of the Stoic doctrine on the subject, the condition of slaves was often very deplorable. This was especially the case with the immense gangs which speculators employed in industry and manufacture. Apuleius gives a harrowing description of slaves working in a mill. These wretches, pale and almost naked, wore rings on their feet, their skin was discolored and furrowed with the black mark of the lash, their eyes were nearly blind from smoke and steam. The condition of slaves in private families, and even in small private ergastula, was comparatively exempt from such rigors. The disadvantages and dangers of life at Rome were often enlarged upon by Latin writers. Both Horace and Pliny the Younger contrast the advantage of country life with the miseries and hardships of the capital. Juvenal, in his third satire, represents Umbricius starting for Cumae, and relating the causes which have driven him from Rome. To begin with, the outbreak of epidemics was a constant occurrence at Rome. Serious pestilences broke out in 23 and 22 B.C., in 65 A.D. after the Great Fire, in 79 A.D. just after the eruption of Vesuvius. On the last occasion, 10,000 deaths sometimes occurred on the same day. The most virulent of all was the plague in the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Fires were a much more frequent evil. Moreover, living was very dear at Rome compared with the municipal towns of Italy. The yearly rent of a garret at the top of a Roman lodging-house would have purchased a house and garden at Sora or Frusino. The city was consequently full of poor people, humilus, in straitened circumstances, trying to keep up appearances. Men who made a great show were often bankrupt. Besides this great drawback of dear prices, the man of modest means found everything adverse to comfort and tranquillity in Rome. During the daytime, the ordinary traffic made the streets very noisy, and at night there was the rumbling of the vehicles which were not allowed to pass through the streets by day. Sleep was the luxury of the rich. Even walking in the narrow, crowded streets was a disagreeable and dangerous necessity for the man who was not rich enough to afford to be carried at his ease in a litter. He ran the risk of being struck in the side by planks of timber, of being trodden on by a soldier's hobnailed boots, of being crushed to death under a wagon load of stone. At night a poor man in the streets was exposed to all sorts of dangers. There were the chances of being struck in the head by things thrown out of high windows, and there was the possibility of being assailed by thieves, or bidden to stand by quarrelsome bullies, or one of those bands of profligate young men, which were brought into fashion by the example of Nero. Those who fell into their hands were unmercifully beaten, sometimes tossed in blankets. Even the rich were glad to leave their houses on the Esquiline and Caelian for their villas on the Campanian coast or in the Tuscan hills. Literary men were never tired of contrasting the pleasures of the country with the weariness of town life. "Country, when shall I see you," cries Horace, "and be restored to my book, and sleep, and pleasant idleness?" Pliny and Juvenal echo the same cry. Thus imperial Rome presents many points of comparison with a large modern capital. Wealth there had the same advantages; there were the same vast inequalities in its distribution, and the same glaring contrasts between indigence and luxury. Seneca, who was very rich, was said to have amassed 300,000,000 sesterces (2,400,000 pounds) within 4 years. The fortune of the freedman Narcissus was 400,000,000 (3,200,000 pounds). One of the favorite extravagances, not only of the wealthy, but of men of moderate income, was the possession of a number of houses and villas in different places. Cicero and the younger Pliny, for example, kept up several country houses. In regard to luxury of living the fashion set by the court exercised doubtless considerable influence, and it is expressly stated by Tacitus that a great change for the better took place after the death of Nero. To illustrate the extravagance of the earlier period, it may be mentioned that Seneca possessed 500 tables with ivory feet, and that at a dinner given in winter to Nero, more than 4,000,000 sesterces (32,000 pounds) were spent on roses. A gourmand named Apicius, who lived in the time of Augustus and Tiberius, became proverbial for the pleasures of the table. But although Vespasian's moderate example seems to have brought about a reaction, and the emperors of the second century were simple in their way of living, the age of Juvenal seems to have had many a rival of Apicius. In a letter to his friend Persius, inviting him to a dinner of simple fare, suggested perhaps by the invitation of Horace to Torquatus, Juvenal satirizes the extravagant dinners of the rich more vehemently than Horace. Under the Empire the relation of patron and client still played a part in Roman life, but clients had no longer the same political importance for the patron as under the Republic, and consequently their morning visits were less welcome. The habit of receiving retainers, however, was kept up by the wealthy; but the patron, instead of occasionally asking the client to a right dinner (cena recta), as it was called, used to give him at the morning reception a dole of food, which he carried away in a small basket (sportula), whence the dole itself was called sportula. The next step was to convert the gift in kind into a gift in money, and the amount fixed by custom was 100 quadrantes. Domitian made an attempt to revive the old practice of the cena recta, but did not succeed in introducing it permanently. If we can trust the satirist Juvenal, many persons of low degree supported themselves entirely on the doles of patrons, and even men of high position did not disdain to accept the sportula. The poor client was glad to buy his patron's hospitality by all arts and kinds of flattery and obsequiousness. But in the role of the parasite, the Roman was generally less successful than the more versatile Greek. Juvenal has given us a vivid, and doubtless heightened, picture of the life of the needy parasite, who was in his day as marked a feature of imperial Rome as, in Menander's day, of republican Athens. Trebius, in order to fulfill occasionally a vacant place at a table of his rich patron, Virro, has to break his sleep before dawn and expose himself to the cold night air, in order to attend an early morning reception and present himself to the patron before his rivals. For 2 months, perhaps, he goes without an invitation. At length he receives one. At the dinner, for which he pays so dear, he gets the worst wine, while his host drinks choice Setine. The cup of Virro is jewelled, that of Trebius is of cracked glass; or if he too has a jewelled one placed before him, a slave stands by to see that he does not steal it. The patron and his dependent do not even drink the same water. Trebius has to eat a piece of mouldy black bread, and if he ventures to help himself from Virro's loaf, the slave makes him restore it. Virro eats lobster stewed with oil of venafrum, choice truffles, and fruit; Trebius a common crab, dressed with lamp oil, wretched fungi, and rotten apples. But it is not from stinginess that Virro treats the parasite thus; no, he is bent on mortifying him. You think you are a free guest; he knows that you are the slave of the savour of his kitchen. But the satirist also complains that patrons are less generous than they used to be. Among the Virros of his day, there are none who bestow such generous presents on their modest friends as Seneca or Piso in the time of Nero. Years later, Lucian draws a similar picture of the parasite Nigrinus. It would be a mistake to draw any conclusions as to the morality of Roman society from the stories which are told by the ancient writers of the profligacy of emperors like Gaius or Nero, or from the licentiousness of Messalina. This occasional wickedness in high places might have been compatible with an average standard of morality among the mass of the senators, the knights, and the people. We must also beware of taking too literally, or applying too generally, the heightened pictures of Juvenal. He devotes his longest satire to a description of the depravity of the women of his day, but most of the follies which he lashes are common to all ages. He describes the women who fall in love with actors and gladiators, harp players and flute players; those who affect Greek and profess to be quite ignorant of Latin; those who tyrannize over weak husbands, and those who have 8 husbands in 5 years. He satirizes their love of finery, their love of gossip, and their pride of birth. He ridicules the literary matron who, when she goes out to dine, institutes comparisons between Virgil and Homer. All the philologists and rhetoricians are hushed by her chatter, which is like the noise of basins and bells. Messalina is introduced as a type of female licentiousness; and Hippa, the wife of Veiento, who eloped to Egypt in the company of Sergius, an ugly gladiator, is mentioned as an instance of vulgar passion in noble dames for men of mean calling. Of all the follies of Roman ladies, that which we can least understand is the practice of the gladiator's art. Women of the lowest class often appeared in the arena, and no one thought anything of it; but ladies of high family, both under Nero and under Domitian, dressed as gladiators, with helmets and greaves, and fought in the amphitheatre. This scandalized Juvenal, but Martial speaks of it with an approving smile. The superstition of women is ridiculed by Juvenal, who describes them as ready to fall under the influence of every oriental impostor. Priests of Isis, Jewish hags, Chaldean astrologers, haruspices from the East, are all consulted and believed. The cruelty of ladies to their slaves is portrayed vividly. If they get up in a cross temper, their maids and tiremen (cosmetae) are flogged. Some, he says, pay so much as a year for the use of the public torturers, in order to punish their slaves. Juvenal seeks for the causes of the degeneracy of morals, and indicates 3. 1. the evils of a long period of peace, which induces idleness and luxury; 2. the great increase of wealth, which produces the same effects; and 3. the influx of foreign nations, who brought with them effeminacy and debauchery. Since Roman poverty departed, he says, every lust is in our midst. There can be no doubt that these were the chief causes of the difference between Rome in the 3rd century B.C. and Rome in the 1st century A.D. The close connection between the three causes assigned is evident. Schools and education. At Rome education was not compulsory, but it was general. The fees at the elementary schools were low, not more than 15 shillings a year. Under the Empire men of the highest rank sent their children to public schools. Members of the imperial family, however, were always taught at home. The elementary school of the literator, or ludi magister, must be distinguished from the advanced schools of the grammaticus and the rhetor. The schools seem to have been held in porticos opening on the street, and the noise of the classes was often a nuisance to the neighbors. Martial assigns the din of a school near his lodgings as one of the causes which drive him to seek rest at his Nomentane villa. Children began to attend school at about 7 years old, and boys and girls were taught together. The school year began on the 24th of March, the day following the 5-day festival of Minerva, called Quinquartis, and the new pupil then paid his first fee, which was called Minervale. These 5 days in March and the week of the Saturnalia in December were the only school vacations; but the Nundinae were always free days. School began before dawn. The boys used to bring their own lamps. There was an interval for breakfast, prandium. Children were accompanied to school by a servant called the pedagogus, who had control over them and probably superintended the preparation of their lessons. Another slave, the capsurius, carried the books. The discipline both of the literator and of the grammaticus was strict. We hear much of the schoolmaster's ferule. Orbilius, the schoolmaster who taught Horace, was famous for his severity. On leaving the literator, children who were destined to have a higher education could go on to the grammaticus, who gave instruction in the recitation and interpretation of the Greek and Latin poets. Acquaintance with Greek began at an early age, and we read of a Greek maid being kept to exercise young children in talking the language, just as English children have French and German nursery governesses. Great stress was laid on the art of elocution. The master used to read passages aloud, and the pupils used to repeat them after him and practice the right emphasis. The meaning was explained in great detail. Of Greek poets, Homer and Menander were the favorites. Statius gives a list of those who were read at his father's school in Naples. It includes Hesiod and Pindar, Alcman, Stesichorus and Sappho, Sophron Callimachus and Lycophron. Of later poets, Virgil, Horace, and Lucan were the most popular in the 1st century. Statius seems to have been read at schools in his own lifetime. In the 2nd century the school course was affected by the reaction in taste, and early writers were introduced, such as Ennius and Plautus. Music and geometry also came into the encyclic education, which was preliminary to the study of rhetoric. At the schools of the rhetoricians, prose authors were studied instead of the poets, and the art of prose composition and declamation was practiced. "Do you teach to declaim?" was a way of asking, "Are you a rhetorician?" The classes were very large. The lecturer sat in a high chair, cathedru, and the pupils sat on benches, subsellia, or stood. The subjects of the declamations frequently turned on historical questions, such as, "Should Hannibal have marched on Rome after his victory at Cannae?" or, "Advice to Sulla to abdicate." Such declamations were called sporsoriae, and are distinguished from the controversiae, which handled legal questions. Juvenal satirizes the tedious sameness of the subjects discussed in these essays. The parents used to come on special days to hear their sons declaim. CHAPTER 31.